I hadn't even turned off the engine when I noticed the ground didn't look right. From the top of the hill, my land used to roll out in quiet lines, grass, fence, a long stretch my grandfather always kept untouched. But now, there was a strip cut straight through it. Wide. Flattened. Too clean to be a mistake. I stepped out slowly. The air smelled like fresh dirt and fuel. Then I saw it, a windsock, snapping in the morning breeze. Bright orange. New. And before I could process that, I heard it. A low hum, growing louder. I looked up just in time to see a small plane drop out of the sky and line up with that strip, my land, like it had done it 100 times before. It touched down smoothly. Rolled right across the center of my property. No hesitation. No permission. Behind me, gravel crunched. I turned. She was standing there, HOA president. Perfect posture. Folder in her hand like this was just another routine update. You should have checked your mail, she said calmly. It's all approved. I didn't answer. My eyes went past her, back to that runway carved through something that had never been touched in decades. Approved? I repeated. She nodded once. Confident. You were deployed. We couldn't just wait forever. For a second, everything went quiet again. Then I looked at the paper in her hand, and the plane idling on my land. And I asked the only question that actually mattered. Approved, by who? If you're into real stories where calm decisions beat powerful systems, make sure to subscribe. And tell me this, if someone used your land while you were gone, would you fight it, or let it go? Because what happened next wasn't what they expected. Before the runway, before the noise, before anyone thought they could use it, that land had been quiet for decades. It wasn't just property. It was structured that way on purpose. My grandfather bought it long before there were paved roads anywhere near it. He chose that stretch, the long, flat section running across the center, not because it was easy to build on, but because he never wanted anything built there at all. He used to say some parts of land aren't meant to be touched. They're meant to stay clear. And he kept it that way. Even after he passed it down, nothing changed. No fences cutting through it. No barns. No driveways. Just open ground that ran clean from one end of the property to the other. When I deployed, that's exactly how I left it. Locked gates. Clear boundaries. No active use, but that didn't mean unclaimed. The problem was, from the outside, it didn't look like that. A few months after I left, the area around my land started changing. A developer moved in on the neighboring acreage. What used to be empty fields turned into roads, model homes, clean sidewalks. They called it a private lifestyle community. Quiet. Controlled. Exclusive. And then they added something new to their pitch. Access. Not just road access. Not just views. Air access. Small private planes. Weekend arrivals. Buyers flying in without ever touching a public airport. It sounded expensive. It sounded exclusive. It sounded like something that would sell fast. There was just one problem. They didn't have the space for it. Not on their side, anyway. But right next to them, there was a long, perfectly flat stretch of land. Open. Untouched. Running in a straight line like it had been designed for something. My land. They reached out at first, emails, letters, formal requests. Temporary access. Shared use. Mutual benefit. All the usual language. I never answered. Not because I agreed. Because I wasn't there. Deployment doesn't leave room for negotiations about your property back home. But silence, to the wrong people, doesn't mean no. It means opportunity. And somewhere between those unopened messages and that cleared strip I was now standing on, someone decided they didn't need my answer at all. I didn't argue with her on the driveway. Not yet. Instead, I walked past the runway and started looking at it the way I'd been trained to look at anything that didn't make sense: quiet, slow, piece by piece. The surface had been leveled recently. You could still see the tire impressions from heavy equipment pressed into the edges. White temporary markers lined both sides, spaced too evenly to be random. At the far end, a portable light unit had been set up, angled toward the strip like they expected landings at dusk. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. Halfway down the strip, I stopped. There were survey stakes driven into the ground, bright flags still attached. I crouched down, brushed the dirt away, and found the markings stamped into the wood. Coordinates. Property lines. But they didn't match what I remembered. I stood up slowly and looked back toward the house. Then toward the new development beyond the fence line. Everything had been shifted just enough to blur where one property ended and the other began. Just enough to make it look acceptable. Behind me, I heard footsteps again. The board handled everything, she said, like she was explaining a schedule change. We followed the process. I turned this time. What process? She opened the folder and handed me a document. Clean. Official looking. Stamped. Temporary private airstrip approval, community access use. My address was printed on it. So was my land. And under owner acknowledgement, there was a line. Signed. I stared at it for a second longer than I should have. It looked right at a glance. Structured. Filed. Approved. But something about it felt off. I shifted my grip slightly, scanning the page again. Dates. References. Sections pulled from zoning codes. It was detailed enough to convince anyone who didn't look twice. And that was the problem. It was built to be accepted. They gave you notice, she added, calm as ever. Multiple times. I didn't respond. My eyes were still on that signature line. Not the name. Not the ink. The space around it. There was something missing. I lowered the paper slowly. Who signed this? I asked. She didn't hesitate. The approval came through proper channels. That wasn't what I asked. I looked past her, back at the strip cutting across my land, and then down at the document in my hand. Because whatever they had built out here didn't start with the ground. It started with that paper. And something about it didn't add up. I didn't push her any further on the driveway, arguing there wouldn't change anything. Not with a plane still idling behind me and a document she clearly believed in more than anything I could say. So I let her walk. And I started collecting. The HOA office was set up inside one of the model homes, clean glass walls, staged furniture, everything designed to look permanent even if it wasn't. When I walked in, conversations dipped just slightly. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to notice. The board was already there. 3 members. The president at the center. And off to the side, leaning casually against the counter, the developer. He didn't introduce himself. Didn't need to. The way everyone looked at him made it clear who was actually running things. We weren't expecting you back so soon, the president said, polite but controlled. I wasn't expecting a runway, I replied. A brief pause. Then she gestured toward the table. We followed procedure. That line again. I set the document down in front of them. Walk me through it. They did. Step by step. Notice sent. No response. Follow-up sent. No response. Board review. Conditional approval. Temporary use classification. On paper, it sounded clean. That was the point. This is a standard access agreement under Community Development Code, one of the board members added, tapping the page. It's not permanent. The developer finally spoke. It's actually a benefit to you, he said. Calm. Confident. Improves land value. Brings attention to the area. I didn't respond to that. Instead, I flipped the page. There it was again. That signature line. Who verified this? I asked. The president leaned forward slightly. It was processed through the proper office. Which one? A beat too long before she answered. County. I nodded once, like that made sense. Then I gathered the document and stood. If it's clean, I said, you won't mind me checking. The developer smiled faintly. You're welcome to, he said. But you're going to find the same thing we did. That confidence again. Not aggressive. Worse. Certain. The county office was quiet that afternoon. Older building. Paper still mattered there. I placed the document on the counter. I need to verify this approval. The clerk adjusted her glasses and scanned the page slowly. Her finger traced the reference numbers, moving line by line. For a second, I thought she was going to confirm it. Looks filed, she said. Stamped too. But she didn't hand it back right away. Her finger paused. Right near the bottom. Near the signature block. Where'd you get this? She asked. From the people using my land. She leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to show she'd noticed something. This type of approval, she said slowly, usually doesn't stop here. Meaning? She tapped the page once. It's supposed to go through more than one office. I didn't say anything. She flipped the document over, checked the back, then turned it upright again. It's structured right, she admitted. Formatted correctly. Filed in the system. Then she looked up at me. But it feels incomplete. That word again. Incomplete. I took the paper back, folding it once this time instead of leaving it flat. Outside, I stood for a moment without moving. Behind me, inside that office, everything had looked official. Back at the property, everything looked operational. Planes landing. Equipment moving. People acting like it was already settled. But both places had the same problem. They were moving forward on something that wasn't fully finished. And the more I looked at that signature line, the more it felt like they were betting I wouldn't notice. By the next morning, the airstrip wasn't just there. It was active. I didn't have to look for it this time. The sound carried across the property before I even stepped outside. Low engines, steady passes overhead, tires hitting dirt in controlled landings like this had been happening for weeks. Because it had. A second plane came in before noon. Smaller. Sleeker. It didn't just land, it arrived. Doors opened, 2 men stepped out in pressed clothes, and within minutes a sales rep from the development was walking them toward the model homes like this was part of the experience. Air access. That was the pitch. And my land had become the runway for it. I drove along the edge of the strip, keeping distance, watching the flow. Temporary cones had been added since yesterday. A portable sign now stood near the entrance. Private landing, authorized use only. Not a single mention of ownership. Not a single boundary marker that matched what I remembered. They weren't just using the land. They were redefining it. By afternoon, I went back to the county office. This time, I didn't go to the front counter. I asked for records. Older ones. Zoning overlays. Aviation filings. Anything tied to the parcel before the development ever showed up. The clerk from yesterday pointed me toward a back room, quiet, dim, the kind of place where documents didn't get updated unless someone had a reason. I started pulling files. Year by year. Most of it was routine, tax records, transfers, survey updates. Nothing unusual. Until I found a reference buried in a decades-old zoning note. It wasn't labeled clearly. Just a line under a section that didn't match anything current. Restricted coordination zone, aviation related. No explanation. No active flag. Just there. I took a photo of it and brought it back to the front. What is this? I asked. The clerk looked at it, then at me. "That's old," she said. "Probably not active anymore." "Probably?" She hesitated. "It's not something we handle directly." "Who does?" Another pause. Then she lowered her voice slightly. "Anything aviation related that involves restricted zones doesn't stop at county level." That matched what she'd said before. Multiple offices. More than one layer. And that document the HOA gave me? It only showed one. When I got back to the property, there were more vehicles than before. A temporary tent had been set up near the runway. Tables. Banners. A small group gathered like it was some kind of preview event. The developer was there again, talking to a couple standing beside a freshly landed plane. "Exclusive access," he was saying. "Direct arrival. No public terminals." They nodded, impressed. Of course they were. Because from where they stood, everything looked finished. The HOA president spotted me as I walked up. "You've had time to review everything," she said. "Not a question. I've had time to look at what's missing." Her expression didn't change. "It's all been processed." "Not all of it." A slight shift this time. Small, but there. Behind her, another plane began its approach. Closer this time. Lower. Like it had full clearance to be there. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't argue. Just stepped past her and looked down the length of the strip again. Perfect alignment. Clean surface. Active use. Everything about it said this had already been decided. But that note in the file, that one line. Restricted coordination zone. And the clerk's words. It doesn't stop here. They were operating like the approval they had was enough. Like it covered everything. Like no one would question it. But the more I looked at it, the more it felt like they had only cleared the part that was easy. And built everything else on top of what they didn't understand. That night, the noise didn't stop. Even after the last plane was gone, even after the lights along the strip dimmed to a dull glow, the ground still felt different. Like something had been pulled tight across it that didn't belong there. I stood out near the edge of the runway, just past where the markers ended. This was the part my grandfather never touched. He used to walk this stretch without saying much, just looking out across it like he was checking something no one else could see. When I was younger, I asked him once why he kept it clear. He didn't give a long answer. Just said, "Some ground isn't empty. It's reserved." At the time, I thought he meant farming. Or maybe future plans. Now I wasn't so sure. The wind picked up slightly, catching the edge of one of the temporary flags. It snapped once, sharp, then went still again. Everything out here had been measured, flattened, adjusted to fit someone else's plan. And for a moment, I considered letting it go. Not because they were right. Because they were already in motion. Planes landing. Buyers walking the property. Paperwork filed just clean enough to pass a glance. Even the county office didn't fully push back. Fighting something like that doesn't stop it. It drags it out. Turns it into time, money, attention, things they clearly had more of than I did standing there alone. I looked down the length of the strip again. Perfect line. Straight through the center. Through the one part of the land that had never been used. They thought that made it available. That no activity meant no claim. That silence meant permission. I exhaled slowly, letting that thought settle. Then I turned back toward the house. Because if they were building on what they thought was empty, then they hadn't looked far enough. And whatever this land actually held, it wasn't something they could just flatten and fly over. By the third day, it looked settled. Not officially. Not on paper. But in every way that mattered to the people using it, the airstrip was already part of the property. More planes came in. Cleaner approaches. Faster turnarounds. Like the pilots had memorized the strip. Like it had been added to something they trusted. And with every landing, the same pattern followed. Doors open. Buyers step out. A short walk across my land, and straight into a sales pitch. I stopped going down to the strip. Not because I didn't care. Because standing there watching it happen didn't change anything. So I shifted back to the documents. Pulled everything I could. Zoning approvals. Aviation filings. Development permits. Cross-reference dates, departments, signatures. And piece by piece, it started to line up. The approval they showed me? It existed. Filed. Stamped. Logged in the system. I went back to the county one more time, this time with everything organized. The clerk reviewed it again, slower this time. More thorough. This matches what we have, she said finally. No hesitation. No pause. Just confirmation. Even the reference I had found, the restricted coordination zone, didn't give me anything clear. It was there. But outdated. Unverified. Not actively enforced. Nothing I could use directly. Nothing that stopped what was already happening. I called the local attorney that afternoon. Walked him through everything. Sent copies of the documents. Waited. When he called back, his tone was careful. They've covered their base, he said. At least at the level they're operating. Meaning? Meaning from a local standpoint, this is going to be hard to challenge. Hard. Not impossible. But not simple either. By evening, the developer had added new signage near the entrance. Private air access, exclusive community feature. Permanent wording. Not temporary. I stood at the edge of the property as another plane came in low, lining up with the strip like it belonged there. No hesitation. No interruption. And for the first time since I got back, it felt like they might be right. Like whatever gap I thought I saw in that document wasn't enough to stop something that had already been built, approved, and put into use. Because from where I was standing, everything they needed looked complete. And whatever was missing wasn't obvious enough to matter. It didn't come from a new file. It came from something I had already seen. That line. The one buried in the old zoning record. Restricted coordination zone, aviation related. At the time, it felt like a dead end. Too vague. Too old. Not something anyone was actively enforcing. But that night, going back through everything again, it started to stand out differently. Not what it said. Where it showed up. It wasn't listed under current zoning. It wasn't part of the developer's filings. And it definitely wasn't mentioned anywhere in the HOA's approval packet. Which didn't make sense. Because if it didn't matter, it wouldn't have been there at all. I pulled up the property history again, slower this time. Not scanning, tracking. Dates. Transfers. Notes that had been carried forward without explanation. And that's when I saw it. The reference didn't belong to the development phase. It went further back. Much further. Before the HOA. Before the county code even looked the way it does now. I traced the number attached to that note and followed it through older records. Archived entries. Cross-references. A system that hadn't been updated, just layered over. And buried inside one of those older files was a connection. Not to zoning. Not to local approval. To something above it. The wording changed slightly across documents, but the meaning didn't. This wasn't just a label. It was a boundary. And anything tied to aviation inside that boundary wasn't supposed to be cleared at the level the HOA had used. I leaned back, looking at the document in front of me again. The one they were so confident in. The one stamped, filed, accepted. It covered the ground. It covered the use. It even covered the timeline. But it didn't mention that zone. Not once. And that meant one thing. They hadn't ignored it. They hadn't worked around it. They never saw it at all. I didn't go back to the HOA. Not yet. Because whatever I had just found didn't belong in that room. The reference number tied to that restricted coordination zone wasn't local. It didn't match anything in county records. It pointed somewhere else, somewhere older, buried under layers that hadn't been touched in years. So I stopped looking where they had looked. And started looking where they hadn't. The next morning, I made one call. Not to a lawyer. Not to the county. To someone who would recognize that kind of language without needing it explained. Military legal. I didn't oversell it. Didn't frame it as a conflict. Just gave them the facts. Property location. Current use. The document the HOA was relying on. And that one line from the old record. There was a pause on the other end after I read it out. Not confusion. Recognition. Send me everything you have, he said. I did. Maps. Coordinates. Copies of the approval. The zoning reference. Then I waited. It didn't take long. A few hours later, my phone rang. His tone had changed. More direct now. Less cautious. That land, he said, was part of a designated emergency coordination corridor. I didn't say anything. Let him finish. Years ago, decades, actually, certain rural areas were mapped out as contingency landing zones. Not active bases. Not maintained. But reserved. Cleared. Protected in the system in case they were ever needed. I looked out across the strip as he spoke. The same stretch my grandfather never built on. They don't show up in modern zoning, he continued. Most people don't even know they exist anymore. But they're still recorded. Recorded where? Not at the county level. That matched everything I had seen. Everything that didn't add up. So what does that mean? I asked. Another pause. Shorter this time. It means, he said, any aviation activity inside that corridor requires coordination beyond local approval. I let that sit for a second. Then I asked the only thing that mattered. What kind of coordination? Federal. The word didn't sound dramatic. He didn't raise his voice. But it changed everything. I looked back down at the document in my hand. The one the HOA had been relying on. Clean. Structured. Stamped. Does their approval cover that? I asked. I already knew the answer. No, he said. Then what are they missing? He didn't hesitate this time. They're missing the only signature that actually authorizes it. I turned the page slowly, eyes settling on that same line again. Owner acknowledgement. County approval. Developer sign-off. Everything in place. Except one. Who signs that? I asked. The agency responsible for that corridor, he said. And without it, nothing built for aviation in that zone is valid. I exhaled slowly. Not relief. Not yet. Just clarity. Because now it made sense. Why the document felt complete, but not finished. Why the clerk hesitated. Why that line in the zoning file had been left untouched instead of removed. They hadn't cleared the highest level. They hadn't even known it was there. They've already built it, I said. Planes are landing. Another pause. Longer this time. Then they've been operating without authorization. I let that settle. Looked out across the strip again. The lights. The markers. The perfect alignment. Everything built on the assumption that the approval they had was enough. What happens now? I asked. His answer was simple. That depends on whether you want it to stop. I looked down at the ground beneath my feet. That same stretch. Untouched for decades. Not empty. Reserved. My grandfather never explained it. Not fully. He didn't need to. He just made sure it stayed clear. And now I knew why. Because that land wasn't just part of the property. It was part of something larger. Something the HOA couldn't see. The developer couldn't access. And no local approval could override. I folded the document once. Carefully this time. Send me what I need, I said. I already am. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. Attachments. Official language. Clear wording. And at the center of it, the same thing that had been missing from the beginning. A single required authorization. A signature. Not present on their document. Not filed in their system. Not requested through any of their channels. The only one that mattered. I looked back toward the runway one more time. Another plane was approaching. Low. Steady. Confident. Just like the people who built it. They thought they had approval. They thought they had coverage. They thought the system they followed was the system that controlled this land. They were wrong. Because the part they never saw was the one they needed the most. And all it took was one missing signature. They scheduled the meeting like it was a formality. Community update, the notice said. Open attendance. Presentation of progress. Future plans. By the time I arrived, the room was already full. Homeowners. Prospective buyers. A few investors. The developer standing near the front, relaxed, confident. A large board behind him showed clean renderings, finished homes, landscaped streets, and right through the center of it all, a runway. Not temporary anymore. Integrated. The HOA president stood at the podium, flipping through prepared notes. And as you've seen over the past week, our private air access feature has already begun operating smoothly, she said. This positions our community at a level most developments never reach. Murmurs of approval moved through the room. She gestured toward the images behind her. Direct arrivals. No public congestion. Exclusive access for residents and guests. Everything about it sounded finished. Planned. Successful. I stayed near the back. Listened. Watched. Let them build their version of the story first. Then the developer stepped forward. We've secured all necessary approvals at the county level, he said. Operations are already underway, and we're expanding access in the coming phase. He paused just long enough for it to sound final. Like there was nothing left to question. That's when I started walking. Not fast. Not slow. Just enough to shift the room. A few people turned as I moved forward. Conversations lowered. The president noticed first. Her expression didn't change. But her posture did. You've had time to review everything, she said, same tone as before. I have. I didn't stop until I was standing beside the table at the front. The document was already in my hand. You said this was approved, I continued. It is, she replied. Through proper channels. The developer nodded slightly behind her. We followed the process. I set the paper down. Flat. Turned so everyone could see it. Walk them through it, I said. A few heads leaned forward. The president hesitated, then picked it up again, confident. Temporary private airstrip approval, she began. Filed. Stamped. Reviewed. She tapped the signature block. Authorized. I nodded once. Then reached into my folder and placed another document beside it. Different format. Different seal. Now walk them through this one. She didn't touch it right away. Neither did the developer. But the room shifted. Because whatever this was, it didn't look like something they had shown before. What is this? She asked. The part your approval doesn't cover. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't rush. Just pointed to the line that mattered. Read that section. She glanced down. Her eyes moved across the text. Then slowed. Restricted, coordination corridor, she read, less certain now. Keep going. All aviation-related use within designated boundaries requires additional authorization. Her voice trailed off slightly. From who? I asked. She didn't answer. So I did. From the authority that actually controls that airspace. The developer stepped forward now. We've already cleared aviation requirements, he said. We have documentation. You have county documentation, I cut in, calm. Not this. I tapped the second document. This land isn't just zoned. It's designated. Silence. A long time ago, I continued, this stretch was mapped as part of an emergency coordination corridor. It doesn't show up in your system because it doesn't belong to your system. The room had gone still. No side conversations now. No movement. And anything that flies in or out of this zone, I said, requires one more step. I slid the first document, their approval, slightly forward. Then pointed to the signature block. You have the owner line. Another point. You have county. Another. Developer. Then I stopped. But you don't have this. I tapped the empty space where the final authorization should have been. The one signature that actually allows you to operate here. The developer's confidence shifted. Not gone. But cracked. We followed the process, he said again, but this time it sounded different. Less certain. You followed your process, I replied. Not the one that applies to this land. The HOA president looked back down at the document, flipping it once, then again, like the missing piece might appear if she checked it differently. It was filed, she said. It was accepted. Locally, I said. And that's where it stops. Another pause. Longer now. From the back of the room, someone spoke. Does that mean the runway isn't allowed? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at the developer. Gave him the chance. He didn't take it. So I did. It means, I said, steady, you built a runway in airspace you don't control. No reaction at first. Just silence. Then the shift hit. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a quiet understanding moving through the room all at once. The presentation board behind them still showed the finished version. The clean lines. The future they were selling. But the documents on the table told a different story. One missing piece. One signature. And without it, everything they had built wasn't approved at all. It didn't collapse all at once. It unraveled. The first sign was the silence. Not the quiet of the land, the quiet of movement stopping. No engines overhead the next morning. No low passes. No tires touching dirt. The strip sat exactly where it had been the day before, but without anything using it, it looked different. Like something unfinished. By mid-morning, 2 vehicles pulled up near the entrance. Not from the HOA. Not from the developer. Marked. Official. They didn't rush. Didn't make a scene. Just stepped out, walked the length of the strip, and started asking questions no one from the board had answers to. Documentation. Authorization. Clearance. Words the HOA had been using confidently a day ago, now turned back on them. I stayed back. Watched. The president arrived 10 minutes later, folder in hand again, moving with the same control she always had. She handed over the same document. The one she had relied on from the beginning. One of the officials took it, scanned it once, then looked up. "Where is the corridor authorization?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Because there wasn't one. The developer stepped in. "This was approved through county channels," he said. "All filings were completed." The official nodded once. We see that. He handed the paper back. That doesn't apply here. Simple. Direct. Final. There was no argument after that. No back and forth. Just instructions. Operations were halted immediately. No further landings. No use of the strip. No expansion. The temporary signage came down first. Then the cones. Then the portable lights. Each piece removed quietly, like it had never been meant to stay. By the afternoon, the runway was empty again. Still flat. Still cut through the center of the land. But no longer active. The buyers stopped coming. The presentation boards inside the model home were taken down by evening. And the developer, who had stood so confidently in that room the day before, was gone before sunset. The HOA didn't send another notice. Didn't offer another explanation. Because there wasn't one left to give. The approval they had relied on wasn't enough. The process they followed wasn't the right one. And the part they missed was the only part that mattered. I walked out to the center of the strip just before dark. Same place I had stood the first day. Same line cutting across the land. Nothing about the ground had changed. But everything about its use had. No sound. No movement. No claim. Just open space again. The wind moved across it the same way it always had. Uninterrupted. Untouched. I looked down the length of it one last time. Not to check it. To understand it. They hadn't lost because I fought harder. Or louder. They lost because they built something that required permission. From a place they never asked. And when that part showed up, everything else stopped. No court. No long battle. No drawn-out fight. Just a single point of failure. One missing signature. And that was enough. Because in the end, it wasn't about who approved it first. It was about who actually had the authority to say yes. And that answer was never theirs. A week later, the land was quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that comes from something ending suddenly, but the kind that settles back into place, like it was always meant to be there. The strip was still visible. A long line through the center where the ground had been flattened. You could see where the markers used to stand, where the lights had been placed. It would take time for it to disappear completely. But it wasn't being used anymore. And that was enough. The HOA stopped sending notices. The development slowed down. No more planes. No more visitors walking across something that didn't belong to them. Just distance again. Boundaries that made sense. I walked that stretch one morning, the same way my grandfather used to. No rush. No noise. Just checking. He never explained why he kept this part clear. Not fully. But he didn't need to. Because now I understood. Some land doesn't look important until someone tries to use it. And some rules don't show up where people expect them. Until the moment they matter. They thought I was gone. They thought it was open. They were wrong.